Welcome, Peter.
Good morning, Jenny.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history, where you come from, your work, by way of introduction?
Great question to talk about the start. Well, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have been, I got my undergraduate degree in Cork in Ireland and my master's here at UConn School of Social Work. And I came to America in my early 20s, and my area of study was primarily, I was looking at issues of health, and I wanted to work with people who were very sick, or at that time the rare thing about understanding about dying. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969 wrote one of the first books there was on death and dying,
Right.
where she wrote the so-called famous stages. But what I discovered is that I could not get any of my advisors at UConn to work with me around this, nor could I get any social workers to help me do my placement in anything to do with death or dying. And that absolutely amazed me, because it was also during the Vietnam War, when on TV every day there would be the body count. So we were talking about death all the time. But in social work, as in healthcare, death was completely hidden. And I began to seek out people. And I finally found one man who, as a social worker, took me to the VA where he was working. I was his very first social work student. And I was lucky enough to work with patients who were dying. I was in my early 20s. And over the course of those 9 months that I was in my placement, 26 of the 29 patients that I was working with died. What happened is, in my classes and amongst my friends and colleagues here, is almost all of them would shun me. Not me personally, but didn't want to talk about it. And around that time, hospice was starting. And the hospice in America started here in New Haven, and the first medical director, Dr. Sylvia Lack, had heard about my work at the VA, and I was invited to apply for the first full-time job as social worker, and I did. And it was an amazing experience. I spent the next 5 years working there. Around that time, I also began to teach at UConn. Some people who thought that maybe, as weird as it was to work with issues of dying, they thought maybe I could teach a course on it. And I began to teach. And I've taught that course at UConn and at Smith College in Massachusetts School of Social Work for the next 25, 30 years. But it's interesting is that the courses on death and dying are all electives. And that's kind of how I think we see death in America.
As though it's optional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm here today at a very different place in my career, looking back on different places where I've worked and seeing how the dialogue, the language about the vocabulary about death and dying has changed. So that, for instance, it's not unusual today that if you watch a soap opera, they'll reference the stages of dying, Kubler-Ross's. I mean, they don't often seem to know what they're talking about, but not that I'm an expert on soap operas, but they everybody seems to know. If I get the Journey of Grief, which people have as a handout today, if I even go to Staples or somewhere and get that photocopied, people who are working in the office will ask me questions about it. That it's a topic that concerns people. Unlike where I grew up, which was in a small village in Ireland, death here was still not talked about, and it's seen as outside the scope of life. So my interest and goal is, how can we make death speakable as part of life? And I think that there are wonderful opportunities for us to do that. And I think particularly, I worked in substance abuse, and later went to work in child guidance, and I went to work in the forerunner of the connection at also Cornerstone in New Haven, primarily with people with addiction, but also with severe chronic mental illness. And I hope I can just begin to talk a little bit about how, even with what would look like the most impaired population, that this topic resonates, and that by addressing it, it enhances their understanding of life and, I would say, their recovery. Mm. At the same time, as I went through this, my interest kind of developed in theater and literature, and what I found was that I was learning more about people's experience of dying and loss from novels and from plays than I was from any of the texts. Mm. So I now love to see how we can integrate the two.
You mentioned Kubler-Ross. Has our understanding of grief evolved or changed at all in the last 30 or 40 years?
Well, Dr. Kubler-Ross only basically wrote one book. And she wrote a book, and she called it, about death and dying and the stages. She never revised it. She never updated it. And as much as I criticize it, I'd love to have the royalties on it, okay? And it's very easy to critique it. But one of the things that we can't take away from what she did is that she gave modern American society a vocabulary about death, which we didn't have before. That would not have been needed in the village I grew up in, because we had rituals that were very clearly known and understood by everybody. We never had to, there was no need for courses, there was no need for, it was just routine. So as a child, I remember seeing there were rituals for each aspect of life. There was birth, the rituals, and they were primarily, because I grew up in the south of Ireland where 95% of the population were Catholic, but they were around birth, first communion, confirmation, marriage, and death. Now, clearly they match the sacraments, but Irish culture is much, much older than Christianity, so it's easy to see which one came first. But for each of those rituals, that marked time. It marked where you were in life. And the one I think about with death is, when did I first become aware of it? And I first became aware of it is, I remember I was about 4, and a couple of houses down from where I grew up. I remember we were playing outside, and there was commotion. And I don't know who would have told me, but somehow we all knew that the grandmother in there had died. And we went into this house. It was a small kind of a cottage. Now my memory of it, it was dark. We went in, and the grandmother was naturally, as we would have known, she was laid out in her own bed in the bedroom. And people were coming in and paying their respects and saying prayers and then going on their way. And everybody was going by. I remember that, and I don't remember any fear. It didn't seem unusual. It was always that when somebody was brought to the church, we called it a removal, we didn't call it a wake, is that everybody, the bell would ring, and it was kind of like Pavlov's dogs, you could say, but everybody left their house and would walk to the church for a short visit to welcome the body into the church. All ages. Unlike here, where you have to get a babysitter, you have to think about it, you have to decide how well do I know the people. I kind of figured out that you only go to a funeral here if that was a family that might invite you to a wedding. You feel like intrusive almost. Whereas in my experience growing up, it was part of the tradition. You just went to support the community and you supported the family. The first experience of dying as such that I saw was when I was almost 18. I was in my senior year of secondary or high school. My grandfather had come to live with us, and he got sick in a very short space of time. He was now almost 85 and a wonderful man, a great storyteller. I remember him always having unlimited time, because from my experience, he was always retired. Well, if he was here today, he'd say he was only retired a few years, but they were the best years for me. But we went from that active grandfather to someone who was in bed and it looked like he was going to die. And what I remember is my mother asking us, should she send for Julian? Now, Julian was the woman in our village who used to go to any woman who was going to be in labor or anybody who was dying, she would go to their house. A woman with no formal education, would have left school like most women her age at 13 or 14. And her debating whether or not she should send for her it somehow struck me, maybe already in my sort of pre-social work mind, because Juliana happened to be my mother's aunt, and she was in and out of our house. What she was really deciding in a sense was whether she was going to invoke that the dying period was underway. In our modern American healthcare system, that would be invoking the hospice benefit, deciding that the terminal period was underway. So, but there was much, much simpler. Now, Julienne came and she stayed. And the fact that she stayed and she had knowledge of this meant that the dying period was underway. So it sent a signal to the community that others, like sort of second-level relatives, could come and visit. And then I remember in the evening when it was clear that he was in his last few hours, I was with her, my sister, and we were taking turns. But as the night wore on and his breathing got less and less, I remember her telling me different things about the different deaths that she had seen. And you know, I wish, like we have a videotape here today, I wish we had, or even just a little micro recorder, so I could have all of those great stories. But I didn't. And it doesn't matter, because what I would say to you, Ginny, today, or to anybody listening, or I remind myself, what I got from her stories was that she had no fear of what she had seen. Is that this was normal. Very sad, very difficult, but it was not outside of what is possible. Then when my grandfather stopped breathing, I remember we said prayers, and then she took over and she told us to close his eyelids, and we put 2 big old pennies on his eyes to keep them closed. We put the biggest book we had, which was a Bible, under his chin, because I didn't know then about rigor mortis. And she told us the most important thing was that we should leave the room because for the first half hour, that's when final judgment was taking place. And sort of there's an old Irish joke about, you know, you want to not let the devil know you're dead for a full half hour so you get a head start on him. So we had a version of that. But we went to the kitchen and it was 3 a.m. and I remember my mother and others got up and we were drinking tea and eating sandwiches, kind of like visiting workmen. And then I was wondering, how's he doing? How's he making out? And I kind of looked back on his life. But even with those questions, even in death, time can't stop. We had to go back in and we washed him. We laid him out, shaved him, combed his hair. We laid him out in the simple linen garment that all the dead at that time were buried in. And during the day, he was waked in his own bed. The undertaker came that evening, and after all of our community had been in and out, and we lifted his now what was cold and statue-like body, put it in the coffin, put on the top, and nailed it down. Then we carried it in procession through the village. We all took turns shouldering the coffin, where we were greeted, I didn't have to worry, by everybody in our community. And then next day he was buried. And I remember standing at the grave as the dirt was being filled in, that awful sound of the first shovel of dirt hitting the coffin and hearing that thump, and thinking it was so awful, so final, but it was so right. The first death I experienced in America happened to be my Grand-Aunt Julian's son, who was my cousin who had lived here. And he got a brain tumor in his early 40s, and I was only living here 6 months. And his death was very different, very impersonal. We were not allowed to be in the hospital room with him. And we also, I went with his cousin to help arrange for the funeral. And I was horrified. We were, given all kinds of information about caskets that had warranties, ones that, some were 75, some were 150, the different colored cement for the vaults that he was going to be put in. And I remember as we got to his grave, seeing that it didn't look like a grave, because somebody had gotten there before us and put indoor-outdoor carpeting on top of what had to have been the mound of dirt from his grave. It looked weird to me, like that you have this indoor-outdoor carpeting and out in the field.
Right.
And we didn't bury him, and I went there to bury him. We were told to leave because the funeral director, who was no longer an undertaker, he was directing. He said very nicely, "I would like to thank the pallbearers for their help." And I remember bristling, like, what gives him the right to thank me? And then he said, "The family now would like to invite you back for some food." So any of us knows if you want to get people to go from one room to another, you just say, you announce food. So people left. I didn't. I stayed, and I saw this big monstrosity of a backhoe come over and very unceremoniously fill in what was his grave. And then the soil was filled up, and then the grass had been cut out, almost like a fake, like sliced, so that the grass covered the grave. So that by the time I left, it didn't look like anything had happened. So even the ground itself had no scar. Mm-hmm. And so from there, I wanted to look and say, how does this impact our culture, right, the denial of it? And I saw that it's not just people who have psychiatric problems, that we have avoided this. Now, when I say we, obviously people like me who would have grown up have a different experience. If you grew up in a very traditional, let's say, Jewish family, and you're listening to this today, you're saying, oh, but that's not true. We fill in the grave when we're there, and that's true. And there's certain cultural groups, other parts of the country. But for the majority culture, it's meant to be very tidy, very quick. Mm-hmm. And we have language like about closure. And we get tired and really bored of old stories. So I think it's a setup for us to have complicated grief. And I also think that we don't learn from it, nor do we understand what our cultures are. So I always, when I tell that story, I would hope that as the listener, you're saying to yourself, how did my family handle it? Like if I could travel back in time 100 years, where would my family have had a funeral? How would they have buried or handled the ritual of somebody dying? Mm-hmm. And that's a story I think that everybody needs to ask. Because we not only think today, like my courses, that death is optional, but being Americans, we tend to think that we've invented everything. It's a bit like Columbus. We believe we discover everything and there was nothing there before. Mm-hmm. But as I like to think, people have been dying for years. So what do we know about it? What do we understand about it? We have to know about it. So by dismissing our elders, and I would say, as a man talking to you here, Jenny, I would say we've dismissed it because the dying and the dead have always been the province of women. Mm-hmm. And women's stories have less value. Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of the narrative piece of it, that's where we would go. Medicine in the 20th century has been primarily a male area.
Right. So Peter, through these experiences, what have you learned that you would like to share with us, with the audience today? I know you've brought the journey of grief with you. Could you speak a little bit to that?
I'd love to. When I began, Jenny, working at hospice, this was something that my colleague Bess Bailey-Chorsak and I helped create. Mm-hmm. I worked in hospice when it started in New Haven in 1977, and I left there in 1982. During that time, we went from being home care, 18 towns in Greater New Haven, it was the first American hospice, to then having the first facility, which was in Brantford. We opened that in 1980. And by the time I left in 1982, something happened that was a bit of a blip of a news story. It was a marketing concern. I don't know if you or other people here remember it all, but there was a candy that it was wonderful candy that if you ate it, it caused you to lose weight. I mean, here we are coming up to Halloween. Imagine if we had a candy that caused you to lose weight. Mm-hmm. But the candy was called AIDS, AIDS. And so the candy maker were concerned because there was this new disease that began happening in cities like New York, San Francisco, Houston, primarily cities with a large gay population. Right. And men were getting this disease that was first gay-related immune deficiency, but then it began to be known as AIDS. The manufacturers of the candy and the marketing people said, we've got to ride this out. This is not going to last. You know, today you can have you can say any parallels to Ebola, which we're all sort of concerned as we find here in October of 2014. But AIDS didn't go away, the candy did. So what we found is that the deaths that we were seeing at hospice, and we saw a lot. By the time we opened our building in Brantford in 1980, we were having 1,100 deaths a year. I was the first and only full-time social worker for a while. So 1,100 deaths was a huge number. Yes. And since we talked about the family as the unit of care, we then had to address the issue of bereavement. So the bereavement, we set up a bereavement program and had wonderful volunteers. And we wanted to have a way in which we could have a dialogue about this, have a vocabulary again about it. So my friend Bess went on a bit of a sabbatical to California, and she had talked about how we were using the words about grief. Mm-hmm. And a man in her group drew this for her. He was a graphic designer. What I love about this, though, is that even though it was in Southern California, he drew it as only a New Englander might. And it's particularly sort of, I think, I always love teaching about it in the fall, because we're so aware of our seasons. Right. And we have the most beautiful time of the year. But if we had no memory, or if we just dropped in from Mars, we would think the world was dying. The light is changing, there's less and less light. The trees themselves are dying, or so they appear. And yet, those of us who've had more than one fall and who know that spring will come, we have that little thing called winter in between, but so we've used that and we've put together the words that we have here, and we use this to help us create our bereavement services. When we started with this, the prevailing thoughts and wisdom was that bereavement for a big death, it took 2 to 4 months to kind of get over it. That was actually our language. Mm-hmm. Those of us who were doing the work said, this isn't right. This just doesn't, it's not that people are crazy. It just isn't right. The whole concept of getting over it. But that, again, is part of our American desire for neat packages and closure. Mm-hmm. And actually, somebody who's affiliated with the Connection now, Michael Rowe in New Haven, wrote a brilliant article. It was accepted in the Hartford Courant, and maybe you can get it for people about that there's no such thing as closure. And it's one of my favorite short pieces that he tackles that. Mm-hmm. So for us, visually, with this man's drawing, is we show it as a journey, and we show it as all the seasons. What's interesting here is there's no beginning and there's no end. And the language that we use in here are the language that comes from the writers. It's a very short story of what we know about where loss and grief comes from, our language for it. Backtrack to the narrative. the history, the women's story of it is it goes back a long ways. You know, we have cave drawings, but in terms of our modern use of words, primarily we'd have to start with the words that come from the Bible. And the book of Ecclesiastes, which is wonderful. You know, there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to dance, a time to refrain from dancing, a time to mourn, and a time to refrain from mourning. But it didn't have an index. I'm not sure you could kind of get a PDF on it or figure out where is the time to refrain from mourning.
Right.
But it's a beautiful piece. Unfortunately, many of us think that it was the song, but I think the Spinners, or we think Hallmark created that, but it's a bit older.
Yes.
And there's the piece about it that comes with death of mystery. So partly this is an attempt we're always struggling to see when is the time, when is that? So if you go through the Middle Ages, you know, there was Chaucer's, there was you'll find poets in different parts of the world.
I just saw Hamlet last night.
Coming up to Shakespeare. And Shakespeare...
And Hamlet could not stop grieving. He was getting...
Yes. So, and that was in the 1500s, 1500s. So Shakespeare was the first really to write, and the reason Shakespeare, I said, only wrote about death and loss was because he only wrote about love and relationships. And Hamlet, To Sleep Perchance, I mean, there's such great pieces. I've seen it many times. I'd look forward to, and I know it's right now it's running at the Hartford Stage. But he, in his works, like Romeo and Juliet, if you're talking about Macbeth, he captured life and death and its struggles. And even today, with the language that seems remote from us, it has appeal. And he is, to me, a better source of looking at this material than any of the texts if you go into if you're teaching a course on it. Beyond Shakespeare, you really moved into the sort of the poets of a lot of the British poets in the 1800s, and then we come here to Emily Dickinson up in Amherst, Massachusetts, who wrote a lot about death. And one of the things I love, and it relates to this, is one of her simple poems is, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality." She really challenged the idea that death is an elective.
Right.
Because she's saying, and she also was saying, it doesn't matter whether you sign on for this or not. Because as you know, and anybody working in healthcare, if you don't sign a consent form, it doesn't happen. If you don't agree to it, it's not going to happen. She said, it doesn't matter, because I can't stop for death. He'll stop for you. And so how does this begin? So we enter into this journey without any effort. A lot of people believe that the journey of grief is much more like this, that initially it's such an uphill battle. Our language at the time of death, at the time of loss, is all about that, about it being an uphill battle. But that isn't right, because that would require effort, and you don't need to have any effort. So in here, and perhaps later we talked about maybe through the connection, that I might work around doing some courses for the staff around this, so you can get into that and you can see the literature that we've had. Beyond the poets, we had Freud, who wrote Mourning and Melancholia in 1917. We had Eric Lindemann, who wrote in Harvard in 1942 when he studied the survivors of the Coconut Grove fire. Then we had Colin Murray Parks, who was with the English Hospice, who trained us in New Haven. And then, we move forward to, in the 80s, what was actually fascinating, we began to see that even this model, which I wish we could talk more about, but even this model didn't apply to certain peoples. And that was when AIDS came along. Right. And I know that we've had some conversation about this, that the phrase was coined disenfranchised grief.
What does that mean?
Well, it's that your grief, if for instance, the first examples, it could be like a parent who's got a foster child, and the foster child is removed, either because of some problem or because of a success. The family has this foster child, they take him to school, they take him to events, they take him to family parties and holidays, or the child is adopted. Or something happens, a parent takes them back, or a court order. But either way, they have the child one day, the child is gone. Now, for all of us in our work settings, we tend to go and we talk, and if you say, like in this kind of God forbid language, you lost your child or you lost someone in your family, people will give you sympathy and understanding. But if you have a foster child, people are not, it's like, oh, well, you did such great work. I'm sure it was important. It's minimized. The disenfranchised happens internally for the parent, for the foster parent, and for others around them. Began to see things like if somebody was in an illicit relationship, like outside of marriage,
Right.
like an affair. That's another one where you can't, where it's not spoken of. There's so many different types of ones. If you lose a very elderly parent, people will say, oh, he had a great life. Yeah, that's true. Or, oh, you can get another dog or a cat. Like we say that the pet isn't as important. Of course, what we are understanding is that the quality of the relationship depends on how the person puts on it.
Right.
Disenfranchised grief, to me, Kenneth Doka was the first to really put that together, and it broadened our understanding. It intensified it. But it's where things like shame also come into play. Around this time, we began to see that grief is not just like, let's say, all of the literature, by the way, was all based on a heterosexual marriage. The man died, the kind of helpless wife who had to learn how to write a check and who had to figure out how to, get her furnace fixed. It was as if every woman was in that position, was beginning. What we then saw was that there were other types of, we had divorce. We had changes in relationships. We had other losses. And I began, when I worked in substance abuse, to see that there were losses that happened with the loss of a substance. When I worked in prisons, the loss of freedom. You can really define loss in many, many different ways. When the economy began to go down at different times, as it has, you have the loss of a job. It could be the loss of security, loss of freedom. America was built on immigration. What we never ever address is, what was it like for our parents, grandparents, who had to leave another country?
Right.
And we blocked that out. It was a wonderful way of moving forward, but the price of that is huge.
So Peter, certainly our clients are struggling with all kinds of loss, the loss of their families, as you said, the loss of a substance, maybe, the loss of freedom for our CJ clients and others. But I've heard you say that for our staff, we at The Connection can't do good work with our clients until we first reckon with our own personal loss. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
When AIDS first came on the scene, what we had people who were going into crack houses and where people were shooting up, and we wanted them to assist. And I remember thinking that was absolutely insane. First of all, what 12-step work would tell you is that 13-stepping is very dangerous. We were hiring people who were recovering themselves, going into people without the supports.
Right.
In the same way is that in order to do work around grief and loss, we need to prepare the staff, educate them. And one of the ways to educate is by paying attention to what we know about loss and grief. So you have some of the knowledge and skills. But knowledge and skills are only limited in a certain way. What we really need is to have our comfort level. And the only way to have the comfort level is to become aware of what our own narrative, our own history of losses are. It's not that you have to sort of be navel-gazing about this or share it with everybody, but it's important to look at that we are all, as the kids on the school bus would say, we're all losers. Okay? And the fact of how we experience our loss and how we process it is very helpful because it keeps us humble. It stops us being like the way the doctors with the white coat who would come and stand at the door and talk about somebody dying or that there's nothing more they could do. Whereas then when that doctor would get older, they'd say, oh my God, I wished I knew when I was younger what I now know if a doctor themselves confronts their own mortality. Right. So I think we need to have opportunities to do that. That can occur educationally, academically, it can occur in supervision, and it can occur in therapy. But it can also occur on a Friday night when you go on a date and you happen to see Hamlet. And you're thinking, oh my God, I didn't know. We just had season's tickets. I didn't know what we were going to see. But I come out of there and it's like, Eugene O'Neill's plays, Long Day's Journey into Night. I did a lot of work with him. I learned more about addiction and loss from his plays than I have from a million textbooks. I've always been fascinated with what is the way in which when somebody confronts their addiction and the substance and how it controls their life. He gives his mother, his mother, it's actually his real mother, but in that play, he gives her these lines. She's the character Mary Tyrone on Long Day's Journey into Night. She's addicted to morphine. She got addicted to morphine at his birth, blamed him his whole life, so he grew up with this horrible piece of it. But long after she's dead, he writes the play and he gives her almost a soliloquy piece, and this is what she says about her addiction. I've never understood anything about it, except one day long ago, I found I could no longer call my soul my own. I never used to lie about anything, but now I lie about everything. But one day, dear, she goes on, I keep that piece written, and oftentimes when I have somebody who's coming and they're struggling with admitting about their own use, I will have them read that. And because it's not about themselves, people will often read it and they'll cry. And they'll first feel pity for her. And then it takes a while to understand that what they're saying is that that's what happened to them. So going into addiction, as he says, never understood anything about it. It's hard to understand. Except one day, long ago, because it doesn't happen overnight, I found I could no longer call my soul my own. So it's the loss of oneself. So in those ways, I think we can begin to see it. So how do we integrate that with music? Like the song Tears in Heaven, and Boys to Men, any of the songs there's so much great music. And I bet as people are listening, they're thinking of some of their favorite songs and how death is such a part of it. Elton John's Candle in the Wind was one that the whole world paid attention to when Princess Di died, but there's lots of them. Nursery rhymes, all of this is there. So I would say is that by having this be a vocabulary, so that like for the connection to have a course on trauma is wonderful. And trauma we need to pay attention to, but looking at loss is not always about trauma. Mm-hmm. So there's loss that happens. All change involves loss. Right. Like we lose as we constantly move forward. We can't hold on to it. But because our time is almost up, I wanted to end with a piece from one of my greatest teachers. And that teacher was, she was at the ripe old age of about 10 when I got this lesson. Her father had been murdered. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And she went to school one morning, said goodbye to her dad, normal day. She was picked up by her aunt who drove her home, and when she got to her house, the driveway was packed with cars, and she went in, and her mother sobbingly told her that her father was dead, that he had been randomly killed, shot to death. She was brought to me because in my practice to do some bereavement work, and I worked with the family for a while, and she was very difficult to work with. Lovely girl, but very difficult because she hated to talk. She really did. She was just a kid who hated to talk. And if you think about somebody hating to talk being in therapy, that's hard. So I did all kinds of things. And one of the things that seemed to work once in a while was sentence completion. And one day she came to my office, and I used to think, oh, if I can get through the first half minute, then I only have 49 and a half more minutes to sit with her. And she asked me for the very first time about myself, and she said, do you see somebody after you see me? And so I answered her. And then we talked a little more, and then she asked what else I did. And I told her that I didn't see people all the time, that I was also teaching. And it just so happens that the next day I was doing a keynote for school counselors on grief and bereavement. And I told her that. And I said, let's call her Mary. I said, Mary, if you were to be their teacher, what would you want them to know based on your experience? And so she looked at me with that look that's like, I'm not going to talk. So I pulled out my pad and I asked her if she'd write it. And this is what she wrote. This is what she'd want people to know. Be gentle. Don't go on to the subject quickly. Gradually talk about. Wait for their answer if it's a hard question. Make them feel at home. Make sure they feel comfortable where they are sitting, and always make sure they are comfortable with what you are talking about. Try to get out their sad feelings and throw in a smile or two. Add some cheery stuff into the session. Be flexible if they have to miss one session or come late. Be gentle. And today, for the first time, I'm noticing that she put a comma after be gentle. She actually had several commas. And I only noticed when I pulled this out for this, is it was 20 years ago yesterday that she wrote that. And it's my writing, the date. So, her message to us is fairly clear. And that's why I say we know a lot about this. We are not like Columbus. We are not always discovering new things. If we go inside ourselves, we can learn this. So be gentle and don't go into the subject quickly. She didn't say don't talk about it. She said gradually talk about it. So that's, I think, some of what I wanted to say. There's still so much more. George M. Cohan on Broadway said, always leave them wanting more, and clearly I'm like, have so much more I would look forward to having discussion with you, yes. And I know that we will have some questions and answers as well.
That's right. Thank you, Peter, so much.
Thank you, Jenny.